Hi everybody, and welcome to this lecture, probably a couple of videos I think, on Solvency II. So what we're going to talk about is this Solvency II legislation, which is basically how we do reserving or show what the balance sheet is in the European Union and also in the United Kingdom. I'll set out what Solvency II is and then talk about how we used to do reserving before Solvency II. So back in the 2000s and before, we used to do it in a different kind of way. Then I'll get on to what the Solvency II approach is and so how it differs from how we used to do it before, and then finish with a question on what does this mean. We'll probably split into two videos, maybe about halfway through, something like that. So let's get into it and see where we go. So Solvency II. So Solvency II is legislation that applies to insurance companies in the European Union or EU. The United Kingdom used to be in the European Union, so it was at that point that we adopted this legislation as well. The United Kingdom has since left the European Union, but this legislation has remained in place and has changed a little bit, or is changing a little bit, because we can now diverge from exactly what the European Union does. Okay, next bullet. Its approach is generally being adopted around the world. So yes, although it started here, the way in which we are reserving or calculating an insurance company's balance sheet, this kind of way of doing it is basically spreading everywhere because it's kind of sensible. It's all about risk control. So the basic idea is, let's do this in blue, take more risk implies hold more money. And this seems pretty obvious, and so it's perhaps strange that the way in which we used to do reserving and calculating the balance sheet didn't really work like this, or didn't work as much like this. So there were certainly certain things that you could do which were riskier, which would lead to more money being held as a reserve in the old way of doing things, but not all things. Whereas within Solvency II, it's very specific. If you take on more risk, you should be holding more money. It's kind of hard-coded into the way in which Solvency II is built. Okay, let's have a look at the way in which we used to do things. So you'll have a kind of a nice contrast with the new legislation. So call this section Old Style Pre-Solvency II reserving in the United Kingdom. okay, we used to work out the actuarial balance sheet as follows. Whenever you get into this, you start drawing diagrams that look a bit like this, so you end up with kind of multiple rectangles next to each other. This first rectangle I'm going to call dv of a, which means discounted value of assets. So we would come up with a value for our assets by looking at all the future cash flows and then discounting them back to time zero. And that's the value that we would attribute to our assets in the balance sheet. So that's the asset side. On the liability side, you have something that kind of looks a bit like this. Let's break it into three pieces. This gap at the top, let's put that in first. So this is your free assets. You might call this capital or your extra money. So this proves that you're solvent. You want this to always be positive. So you want your assets to be bigger than your liabilities. On the liability side, this bottom piece is prudent discounted value of liabilities. So let's just make that really clear. Discounted value of liabilities. Let's see, let's put in, this thing here is a resilience reserve, and this thing here is a solvency margin. So the prudent discounted value of liabilities meant that we kind of assume that each assumption is a bit worse than it really is. So if your QX for mortality is whatever it is, maybe I make it 20% bigger or something like that. So I'm assuming more people are going to die than actually are going to. So this kind of bit here is bigger than it would otherwise be. And so we're kind of being safe. We're trying to make sure that we definitely have enough money to pay all our claims if we need to. Then this solvency margin thing here is proportional to this, pretty much. So if this is bigger, then this is bigger. If this is smaller, then this is smaller. And then this resilience reserve thing, this protects a little against market risk. So basically, if you were holding a lot of equities in your assets and those equities were going to might crash in value in the future, you would hold a little bit of extra money in order to make sure that you could handle that risk. So if you like, that is holding an amount of money that is associated with taking more risk. So if you hold more equities over here, your resilience reserve would be bigger. If you hold less equities over here, your resilience reserve would be smaller. So in some sense, that's a little bit like what Solvency II is going to do. But that's it. That's the only place really where this kind of more risk more risk means hold more money thing would come in. I guess, I mean, it is also in the prudent discounted value of liabilities. So if you take on people who are more likely to die, then the discounted value of liabilities would be higher as well. So it is there to some extent, but perhaps not fully. Okay, so that's how we used to do things in the past. So what's the problem with doing things in this way? In fact, let's go up to the top. We've done that, and give ourselves some more space. So problems with this are discounted value of assets is not equal to market value of assets. So that implies we don't know our solvency on sale of assets. So this is kind of important. You know, you want your balance sheet to represent how much money you really do have. And this thing here is kind of fictional. It's not the amount of money you get if you sell those assets. So actually, our entire balance sheet calculation, the amount of free assets we have, is essentially incorrect because this thing is not the same as this thing. So that's one problem. And also, we don't know how prudent a company is. Is it very safe? Or is it not very safe? So if we look at this balance sheet, this thing here, is it big enough? Is it much bigger than what we might call the best estimate of our liabilities instead of the prudent discounted value of our liabilities? Or is it close to the best estimate of our liabilities? We don't know. So we kind of don't know how safe we're being, whether this box here is much bigger than it needs to be or only a little bit bigger than it needs to be. So that's a major problem. And also this thing here, if we sell it, we're going to get a different amount of money to what we've calculated here because the discounted value of assets is not equal to the market value of assets. So these two things are problems with the kind of pre-Solvency II approach that Solvency II is going to fix. So if we go back to our agenda, that's those two kind of covered. Let's just put in a break here. So when we come back in the next video, we'll cover these two sections here.